Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're looking at the Chinese economy. We're going beyond the headlines, to get some deeper insights from Qi Jin. Now, she wrote this really interesting book, The New China Playbook.
Yeah.
And she did this interview recently with a Norwegian investment firm that caught my eye.
Mm-hmm.
And it's on their YouTube channel if you want to check it out yourself. But her perspective is just so interesting because she was born in China, educated in the U.S., and she teaches at the London School of Economics.
Yeah, she's got this really interesting global view, right?
Yeah.
It sort of combines the academic rigor with her own personal experience.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, she starts off talking about this economic slowdown that we've all been hearing about. And, everyone's kind of wringing their hands.
Yeah.
But she really emphasizes that it's more about a weak demand than some sort of fundamental collapse.
Yeah, and she really boils that down to like a triple whammy.
Yeah.
There's this pandemic scarring,
Yes.
right? Unlike in the West, the Chinese households didn't get a lot of government support during COVID. Yeah.
So no stimulus checks.
No, not really. So a lot of those households are kind of in a precarious position. And then on top of that, you've got this declining real estate sector.
Yeah. You can't really picture the Chinese economy without that real estate boom.
Yeah, it's been a huge engine of growth for them for decades. So that's a major shift. And then you layer on all of these regulatory controls that the government's put in place over the last few years. And, it started with specific sectors like technology and education.
Right.
But it's created this kind of broader sense of uncertainty for investors.
So it's kind of like a perfect storm.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got the pandemic effects, you've got the real estate decline, and then all this regulatory uncertainty.
Right.
And that's all contributing to this kind of dampened demand.
Precisely. And you know what it's led to? Is this let's wait and see attitude. From both businesses and consumers, they're just holding back on spending and investment, which of course further contributes to the slowdown.
It's like this vicious cycle. But that wait and see thing is interesting, right? It's not really like, oh my God, the sky's falling. It's more like they're just being cautious, just waiting to see how things play out.
Exactly. More recalibration than collapse of confidence.
Yeah. And this is where it gets really fascinating because while all of this is going on, China is also becoming this technological powerhouse.
Right.
So how do you square that?
Right. It seems counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But she actually cites a study that found that China is now leading in 35 out of 44 critical technology research areas.
35 out of 44? That's incredible. What kind of areas are we talking about?
You name it. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, advanced manufacturing, renewable energy. The list goes on and on.
So it's not just research.
No.
Yeah.
It's translating into actual advancements in the real world.
Like what?
You remember what happened with Huawei.
Yeah.
They got hit with those U.S. sanctions.
Right.
And then they developed their own domestic chip-making capability.
Yeah, it was a huge deal.
It was a huge deal. I mean, there was national euphoria. People were joking that the U.S. should sanction their men's soccer team next to try and improve it.
That's funny.
I know, right?
But you can tell how much pride they take in those achievements.
Oh, absolutely. But it goes beyond China, too, You got to remember, 90% of the world's population lives in developing countries. And for a lot of them, Chinese technology is seen as practical, high quality, often more affordable than Western alternatives.
Yeah, it's a completely different perspective.
Totally. And we're seeing this with the rise of all these Chinese apps and brands, right?
Yeah.
Look at TikTok and Shein. They've made huge inroads, even in markets like the U.S.
Yeah, they're everywhere. So it's interesting how you have these two seemingly contradictory things happening at the same time. You got the slowdown, but you've also got this emergence as this technological superpower. It kind of makes you rethink this whole narrative about China's decline, doesn't it?
And that's exactly what Jin is trying to do. Challenge these common misconceptions about China, starting with this whole China's on an inevitable path to decline idea.
Yeah, you see that a lot in the headlines.
All the time. But she pushes back on that pretty hard. She's like, look, growth may have slowed down, but there's still a ton of potential within China.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, like she points out, there's still 900 million people in China living on less than $300 a month. That's a huge segment of the population.
Yeah, it's easy to forget the scale of things over there.
Right. And on top of that, she points out that despite its size and rapid growth, China hasn't had a major financial collapse in 40 years. So that shows a certain level of resilience and stability that I think often gets overlooked.
So maybe instead of decline, we're actually going to see a convergence with developed economies.
That's her argument.
Mm-hmm.
And it all leads into one of the most interesting parts of the interview, I think. this concept of the mayor economy.
The mayor economy. I like that. What is that?
So basically, it's the idea that while China is very centralized politically, right, with all the power at the top, the economy actually operates in a very decentralized manner.
So it's not all just coming from Beijing.
Right. And she tells this great story about having dinner with this party secretary from this city that's like the size of Singapore.
Wow, that's a big city.
Yeah, huge. And this party secretary is incredibly entrepreneurial, totally focused on attracting talent and business to her city. Like it was a microcosm of how this whole decentralized model works.
So these mayors have a lot of power.
They do. And they're incentivized to be innovative and competitive, which really contributes to China's economic dynamism. It's kind of like a network of interconnected but distinct economic ecosystems, each with its own strengths and priorities.
You know, that mayor economy thing is really blowing my mind.
It's a fascinating concept, isn't it?
Yeah. I always just assumed that everything was dictated from the top down.
It's easy to fall into that trap.
But it sounds like if you really want to understand China, you got to look beyond the national level.
Exactly. You need to know what's happening on the ground in those specific cities and regions.
Okay, so we've got this picture of China. They're dealing with this slowdown, but they're also surging ahead in technology.
Right.
And they've got this surprisingly decentralized economic model.
It's definitely more complicated than the simple stories you usually hear.
Way more nuanced.
Exactly.
And I think it's really important to understand those nuances.
It is.
Because they have big implications for how we see China's role in the world. So where do we go from here? What are the challenges they're facing?
All right. Well, that's what we'll get into next.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so we're talking about this mayor economy in China and how it's kind of reshaping my view of how their economy actually works. But I'm curious, what about the challenges? It can't all be sunshine and roses, right?
Well, yeah. Jin definitely doesn't shy away from the obstacles. And one of the biggest ones is debt, especially at the local government level.
Debt, yeah, I've heard that before in relation to China, but what's driving it?
Well, it's kind of tied to all that rapid growth and investment they've had over the past few decades. You know, local governments have often taken on a lot of debt to finance big infrastructure projects. Yeah. And to kind of stimulate their local economies.
So they've been using debt to fuel their growth.
In a way, yeah. And it worked for a while. But now that growth is slowing down, that debt burden is becoming a real problem, especially in areas where those investments haven't really panned out.
I keep thinking about those ghost cities you hear about in China. You know, those huge developments that are basically empty.
Yeah, that's definitely a symptom of this whole debt-fueled building spree. It's a real risk. When those investments go bad, that debt can become unsustainable.
So what happens then? What are the consequences?
Well, it can lead to a whole bunch of problems. Strained budgets, less money for things like education and healthcare, and it can create a lot of financial instability.
It's like a house of cards.
Right.
If one part collapses,
the whole thing could come tumbling down.
You know what else I find interesting? Is this whole thing about shifting incentives for local officials?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in the past, those local officials were mainly judged on economic growth. You know, hitting those GDP targets.
Yeah, makes sense.
High GDP numbers meant promotions, recognition, all that good stuff.
You're running a city, you want to see it doing well.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But lately, there's been a shift. Now there's more emphasis on political loyalty and social stability. And sometimes that comes at the expense of economic efficiency.
So it's not just about growth anymore. It's a lot more complicated.
Way more complicated. And, you know, it makes some officials less willing to take risks or push for reforms because they don't want to jeopardize their careers.
Yeah, the rules in the game have changed.
Exactly. And that can really impact China's overall economic direction. It could slow down innovation and make it harder to deal with some of those structural issues they're facing.
So it's kind of a balancing act.
It is.
Between economic growth and political stability.
Yes.
And all of this ties into another big challenge, right? The whole youth unemployment and skill mismatch thing.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
I've read about that, but what's the skill mismatch all about?
Well, China's invested a ton in higher education. And now they've got this huge pool of college grads. But a lot of them are struggling to find jobs that match their qualifications.
So they're overqualified.
Sometimes, yeah. There's this gap between the skills they're learning and the skills employers actually need.
Why is that? Is the education system just not keeping up?
Well, that's part of it. The system is still geared towards producing graduates for those traditional industries. But the economy is moving so fast towards those tech-driven sectors.
So what they're learning isn't what employers are looking for.
Right. And that creates a lot of frustration and uncertainty for young people, which should have even bigger social and political implications down the line.
Wow. So we've got debt, shifting incentives, skill mismatches. It sounds like China's got a lot on its plate.
It does. But, they've got a history of overcoming challenges. And Jin seems to think they can navigate these ones too.
So there's hope.
I think so. And a lot of that comes from her assessment of the next generation, the younger generation of leaders and entrepreneurs in China.
So the younger generation holds the key.
Maybe. She describes them as different from their parents, more global, more focused on social issues, less willing to just accept the status quo.
That sounds promising. But can they handle all these problems?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Jin sees them as a force for change. But we'll have to wait and see how they deal with these obstacles and shape China's future.
So it's a mix of hope and uncertainty.
Yeah, pretty much. Real challenges, but also huge potential. And the outcome really depends on how this next generation steps up.
Okay, so Jin's given us a lot to think about, but does she offer any advice, like for investors or anyone trying to figure out China's economic future?
Oh yeah, she does. And that's what we'll dive into in the last part.
Okay, looking forward to it. So we've been really digging into Kyujin's take on the Chinese economy.
Yeah, it's been eye-opening.
And she really wants us to rethink how we see China, to go beyond these simple stories of like boom or bust, domination or collapse.
Totally. Like she keeps saying, we need to understand China on its own terms, its history, its culture, its values, because those things really influence how their economy works.
I get that, but can you give me an example? Like, how does culture play into all of this?
Well, she talks about how the Chinese people tend to be more tolerant of government intervention in the economy. They kind of expect the state to play an active role in managing growth and providing stability.
That's interesting. It's different from a lot of Western countries where it's all about individual freedom and limited government.
It's a different approach for sure, but it makes sense when you look at China's history. They've seen how a strong state can drive development, and they're also wary of what can happen with too much unchecked capitalism.
So what might seem controversial in the West could be totally normal in China.
Exactly. And Jin really emphasizes that this historical perspective is key to understanding where China's headed. Their leaders remember the mistakes of the past, and they don't want to repeat them.
What kind of mistakes?
Well, like China has this deep fear of instability. They went through those periods of famine, war, political upheaval. Those things leave a mark.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So there's this huge emphasis on social harmony and economic growth. It's all about maintaining stability.
It's like they're trying to make up for lost time.
In a way, yeah. And that drives their ambition to be a major economic and technological power.
Which, of course, puts them in competition with other countries, like the U.S.
Right, and that creates tension, uncertainty, all of that. But Jin doesn't think it has to lead to conflict.
Okay, so how do we avoid that?
Dialogue, engagement. She says the West needs to try to understand China's perspective, even if we don't always agree.
That's easier said than done, right?
It's tough, especially now. But she sees it as the only way to build trust and find common ground.
So we need to focus on what we have in common, not just our differences.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond those simplistic narratives. No more zero-sum games.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we engage with China in a meaningful way?
Well, she suggests starting with areas where our interests align. Things like climate change, global health, trade.
All things that require cooperation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By working together on those shared challenges, we can hopefully build a more positive relationship.
So it's not about pretending our differences don't exist. It's about managing them while also pursuing common goals.
Exactly. And Jin believes that's not just good for China and the West, but for the whole world.
It's a powerful message for sure.
It is.
And it reminds us that how we handle this relationship with China will have huge consequences, not just for the global economy, but for everything.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, I think Kyujin has given us a lot to think about. She really challenges us to look beyond the headlines and to grapple with the complexities of China's economy and its place in the world.
And she reminds us that it's still a story in progress, one that's going to be shaping the 21st century.
So if you're interested in understanding China and its global impact, I definitely recommend checking out Kyujin's work. Her book, The New China Playbook, is a great place to start. It's full of these really thought-provoking insights.
It's a must-read.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive.
Until next time.
Keep learning, keep exploring, and we'll see you on the next one.